Well, good afternoon, everyone. As David said, my name is Trevor Lackey. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how 15 Square can get involved in supporting the provision of improved healthcare information regarding male circumcision. The agenda is very simple. I'll do a brief introduction to myself, a bit of background as to how this little project came about. I'll give you an overview of the so-called Alder-Hey report that got produced out of it. We'll look at some key findings, draw some conclusions, and then there'll be an opportunity at the end for any questions and answers. So just by way of introduction, I am a chartered engineering consultant, and I specialise in safety assurance, and I'm also a qualified auditor. And that is, unfortunately, as boring as it sounds. But I do operate in a highly legislated and regulatory environment, and a lot of what I do can end up in a court of law, so I have to be very thorough, and that was useful in this little exercise I conducted. I joined 15 Square 2 years ago, or I should say rejoined, as I was part of Norm UK about half a lifetime ago in my early 20s. But back in those days, I lived down in Bristol. I'm from Northern Ireland, as you may have guessed from the accent, but I live down in Bristol now. I've been there since 2000. And it was very difficult to get to the in-person meetings, so I let my membership lapse, but I rejoined 2 years ago. And I'm married now with 2 kids. I don't have much spare time, but what little time I did have, I wanted to get involved in something that would potentially, add value and make a difference. So after attending some meetings, I heard discussions about Alder-Hey, and I decided to conduct a review of their online healthcare material regarding male circumcision. So just before we get into the details on that, a little declaration. As I've said, I'm not a trained medical professional. I'm a trained engineering professional, but not a medical one. I am biased against circumcision, which is something I had to be very conscious of while writing this report. Alder-Hey considers therapeutic male circumcision, i.e. for genuine medical reasons. It does not consider religious circumcision or non-therapeutic male circumcision, including cultural reasons. So both of those topics are excluded from my report, and there's no graphic images in my presentation today. How did this all start? It started with something called the Round Table Report. And the proper title was Providing Choice for the Treatment of Foreskin Conditions, the Case for Reducing Medical Circumcisions. And that report was actually a set of meeting minutes, effectively. It was a meeting that took place back in July 2020 between 15 leading UK medical professionals, and it was led by Professor Simon Kenny, OBE, one of the main guys at Alder-Hey Children's Hospital. And they looked at 5 sort of key areas. They looked at the regional variation in medical circumcision and the uptake of alternatives. They discussed tangible solutions for improved patient choice. They looked at getting a consensus on the treatment of various foreskin conditions, talked a little bit about policy changes, and then I tried to identify some next steps and ways to take those ideas forward. They identified 11 key recommendations, 2 of which identified the need for an online source of medical healthcare advice around male circumcision. And out of that, they generated the Alder-Hey Foreskin Health website. And just before we look at the website, it's worth just spending a little bit of time talking about the Roundtable report. I found it quite refreshing because for the first time I saw the NHS actually talking about things that up until now they've really avoided. And they talked about how medical literature had rarely cited the psychological impact of circumcision, and it was often dismissed by many urologists. And the potential psychological impacts of circumcision have been documented for some time. And they go on to document some very powerful statements. So Sigmund Freud wrote of circumcision anxiety in 1913, and the post-traumatic stress from childhood circumcision was noted back in 1927. They also talk about how in a recent study of 1,072 young boys from the Philippines who were all circumcised between the ages of 8 and 16, 51% of them met the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. And they talk a lot about how men's health issues have received increased public scrutiny, and they recognise that campaign groups opposing circumcision have emerged and have received some high media coverage in recent years. And that last one's particularly important because it has footnote 36 attached to it, which is 15 Square. So they do recognise us, they know who we are, they know what we do, and we are recognised as a footnote in that report. But overall, quite some powerful statements. And those are just the highlights. There's a lot more detail in the Roundtable report itself, but it was the first time I'd ever seen the NHS openly document this sort of material and make extensive references to material that evidence that and support it and back it up. So the website itself, if you do get a copy of my report, there's a hyperlink to this. It looks like that. That's the homepage. Quite a simple website with some simple family-oriented graphics. And the website consists of 7 individual web pages that are listed along the top. So the homepage that you're looking at, there's one for young children, there's one for teenagers and young adults, parents and carers, medical professionals, a page on UK policy, and then a page for support around men's mental health and therapy, charities, etc. So I encourage you all to have a look. But so, scope and boundary, how did I bound my little project? Well, I focused primarily on the content of the Alder Hey Foreskin Health website. And I looked for factual accuracy, I looked at the underpinning evidence, and I also looked at the consistency between all 7 web pages. And there's some excellent information on there, there's no doubt, but there is some statements which need to be challenged. So, conscious of the fact that I'm biased, so how did I deal with that? Well, I looked at a number of other professional bodies and I compared and contrasted what Alder Hey said with what other professional bodies stated on the same topics. And those professional bodies were 15 Square and the lived experience of our members. So I had numerous discussions with various members, including Jason and Dave Smith, and we extracted a lot of that knowledge that's invested in our little charity, and I got that down on paper. I also looked at the National Health Service, the main website for England. The NHS is a very odd organisation. Anthony could probably explain this better than I can, but there's lots and lots of NHS websites and trusts that carry the NHS blue and white logo. All of them have their own websites, all of them offer advice on the same subjects. Some are consistent, some are not. But I stuck to the main NHS website for England. I also looked at the British Association of Paediatric Surgeons, the British Association of Urological Surgeons, and also the British Association of Dermatologists. There's 2 main reasons I chose those lot. Number one, they were either mentioned in the roundtable report or the website, and secondly, they were easily accessible. There were other organisations, but their websites are a little bit restricted. You have to have a NHS email to register and see the content, etc. But those are all freely available and they've got some very good information. The BAUS was particularly good. They publish a set of information leaflets covering all their urological surgeries, including all the ones done in male genitalia, like circumcision, etc. And the British Association of Dermatologists, they've got very good advice on a condition known as lichen sclerosus. So, yeah, some really useful online information. And fundamentally, I looked at it from an engineering point of view and asked myself, are the fundamental basics right? Does everything stack up? Is it consistent? And if there are inconsistencies, what are they and what could the possible solutions be? So that's what the report looks like. That's the front cover. It's a 56-page report. It covers 63 recommendations. And those are split across the 7 web pages, as you see there on the graphic on the right. There's 12 against the children's web page. So the children's web page is written deliberately using very simplistic language for a young child to understand. The teenagers and young adults and the parents' web page are very similar. They're about 95% the same. There's very little difference. So the 19 I've identified there for teenagers and young adults are equally applicable to the parents' page. And then there's the healthcare professionals with 23 recommendations. It's quite a different page. It introduces a whole set of different terminology that isn't used anywhere else on the website, and also talks about additional alternative treatments that aren't mentioned anywhere else. And I thought that was quite odd. They seem to hold back a lot of information for the medical professionals rather than sharing it on the patient's web pages. Just a general observation. But nonetheless, a lot of really, really useful information. Customer friend role. So it's written from the customer friend role. That's a term we have in engineering. And basically, in my line of work, we're often asked to come in to organisations who might be going for a big bid or a big business opportunity, and they asked us to look at their safety procedures and compliance with regulation and legislation, and to make sure they're in the best position to succeed. So we very much come alongside and work with them collaboratively. We're not there to criticise. We're there to make objective feedback and observation on how they can align themselves better to meet the various regulations. And that's very much the mindset that I brought to this exercise. I'm not here to criticise the NHS. I fully respect them. You only have to see what they've done in COVID-19 pandemic to appreciate what they do. And what we've done in this country in terms of national health care is amazing. Not many countries can achieve what we have done. So I'm not here to criticise them, quite the opposite. I want to be part of the solution and I want to help. It's signed by 4 medical professionals. I think in total there was 7 reviewers. 4 of those were medical professionals, including Anthony, who very kindly reviewed the whole document and gave me some very useful guidance and feedback. And the report was sent to Alder Hey on the 8th of November, and it was sent to 3 people, Professor Simon Kenny himself, Harriet Corbett and Rachel Harwood. They're all surgeons up at Alder Hey. So we haven't had a response yet, but it was only 2 weeks ago, so there was a slight delay because at the 11th hour I realised that the BAUS had updated all their information leaflets and I was referring to the old ones. So I had to quickly download them all, reread them and update my report to make sure I was referring to the latest information. But hopefully we'll get a response, and ideally I would love to get the opportunity to sit down with them and discuss some of my findings and observations. And what I'd like to do now is take you through some of those examples. I can't cover all 63 recommendations, but I'll give you a flavour for the sorts of things that I identified. First one is called What is the Foreskin? So there is a section with this title in 3 of the 7 web pages. It's on the children's web page, the teenagers and adults, young adults and parents. And it's very, very small, lacking in detail. The most detailed description of what is the foreskin is actually in the children's page, which is ironic because it's written very simply with very simplistic language. It's not very detailed at all. And the other 2 are just a cut down version of that. And all the reviewers that reviewed the report sort of identified this as a shortfall. It was a missed opportunity. And there needs to be a more detailed and consistent description of the foreskin, and it deserves really, I think, a separate web page with suitable illustrations to do it justice. We really need to explain the anatomy, the natural development, which a lot of parents don't realise, and the functionality of the male foreskin much more clearly. And there is bits dotted throughout the website, but there's no one place that coherently describes all of that detail. And it's very, very important. It's vital information that is needed to inform any decision to choose either circumcision or one of the alternatives. I spoke to one gentleman who was circumcised at the age of 13. He had quite a long recovery because he got an infection and he was off school for 2 months. And when his mother got him home from hospital, she said, if I'd known what they were going to do, I would never have let it happen. So clearly she didn't understand exactly what they were going to do at all. She hadn't been fully informed and she didn't know what was actually going to be done as part of the circumcision operation. And that's quite a common story that we hear. We need to ensure that patients and parents are fully informed to provide their full consent. What are parents actually consenting to? It's a good question. And of course, people, including doctors, justify circumcision often erroneously by convincing themselves that the foreskin has no real purpose. And that's another good reason to include that detail, so that people are clearly aware of exactly what the purpose is and what it does. Second one is recovery time. This is an interesting one. So Alder Hey say it can take a couple of weeks to recover from a circumcision surgery. They also say the penis is swollen for 1 to 2 weeks after the operation, and the glands can feel quite sensitive after a circumcision, and it can take time for this feeling to go away. Second 2 I can kind of get on board with. Might be a little bit short with the 1 to 2 weeks, but the 2 weeks recovery I think is way too short. The NHS say it usually takes at least 10 days to heal after circumcision. You'll probably be advised to take at least 1 week off work to recover. Now, if you're like me, you read that and you thought, hang on, doesn't those 2 sentences directly contradict each other? If it takes 10 days to heal, why do you only take 1 week off work? But they go on to say you should avoid having sex for at least 4 weeks after your operation. So if you heal in 10 days, why do you need to abstain for 4 weeks? That doesn't make any sense. For 3 to 4 days after your operation, it's likely you'll experience discomfort and swelling. So they say 3 to 4 days, Alder Hey say 1 to 2 weeks for swelling. So again, a little inconsistency. And it advises wearing loose fitting clothing for 2 to 3 days after your operation to help avoid irritation. So if you've got discomfort and swelling, and they advise 3 to 4 days, why is it only 2 to 3 days to avoid irritation? Surely those last 2 at the very least should have the same time frame. So there's a bit of inconsistency there in terms of the recovery times, and they all just seem a little bit short in terms of timeline. And that gets even more interesting when you look at the BAUS. Their information leaflet says it can take up to 6 weeks before the penis returns to its final cosmetic appearance. So they're all using slightly different words. One says recovery, one says heal, one says the final cosmetic appearance. I view those all as a variation on the same thing, really. But the BAUS also say all your stitches will dissolve usually within 2 to 3 weeks, which is longer than the entire recovery time for both Alder-Hey and the NHS. And swelling of the penis usually lasts up to 7 to 14 days. Well, okay, that aligns with what Alder-Hey say. So there is some consistency there. But the stitches one is quite interesting. So if you have stitches for 2 to 3 weeks, wearing loose fitting clothing for 2 to 3 days just isn't going to do it. The last thing you want to do is catch a stitch and be quite painful, I would imagine. And it also says refrain from sexual activity for 4 weeks or until the wound is fully healed. So that does align with what NHS say. So there are some areas where they align, some where they absolutely don't. And the BAUS leaflet, it's quite interesting. These are much more realistic, but they do also say wear loose fitting clothing for 2 to 3 days, which I think is odd. It doesn't seem to sit right. So the BAUS information leaflet pretty much includes all of this, as well as these statements. So it's a bit of a confused picture that patients are getting in that information leaflet. And they also say hypersensitivity can last for 2 to 3 weeks, but a few patients describe this lasting longer. And that's a fair comment. I mean, that's the same as what Alder-Hey talk about in terms of the sensitivity, and that's the clinitization period. So that does vary from person to person. Some people are just more sensitive down there than others, and they can take longer. So that's a fair statement, but they've put an average of 2 to 3 week time frame on it. 15 squares say 6 to 8 weeks for a full recovery, provided the patient does not experience any side effects or complications, the most common one being infection. So children will normally heal a little bit faster, maybe towards the 6 weeks. Adults a little bit longer, maybe the full 8 weeks. So quite an interesting picture on recovery time. Next one is language. We've actually touched on this a little bit already. The word uncircumcised is used extensively throughout the whole website. And it's a common term in cutting cultures like America, but it also has strong religious meaning. It's used extensively in the Bible to distinguish between the Jewish and the Gentile communities. And it's an adjective that clearly implies that circumcision is the norm. And clearly in the UK and the rest of Europe, that just isn't true. So why do we use it on UK websites? So I've recommended that they remove the term uncircumcised entirely from the website and replace it with the word intact. There was a lot of debate on what was the right word, but intact just seemed to sit better as a descriptive term. It's interesting because the little animation, the little picture, you can't even see it on the website. It's blurred out, and there's a little message saying click if you want to see the image. And I thought that was quite odd. On a website that's talking about male circumcision, they still seem to be afraid to actually show any images, even a simplistic cartoon image. And it's shown extensively throughout the whole website, this one repeating image. That, okay, it serves a purpose, and in the one sense, I can understand that it's a family-oriented website, and including for young children. On the other hand, I think they really need to do it justice with some proper illustrations to show exactly what a circumcision does. So it does, I feel, downplay the whole issue of circumcision. But I've recommended that they change it to intact. And that just helps to focus on the medicine and avoid any unnecessary confusion with both the cultural and the religious context. It's also interesting, I was chatting to some people about this. You don't refer to someone's arms as being unamputated. You don't refer to a woman's breast as being unmastectomized. When you use that sort of language in any other context, you begin to realize just how strange it is. There's no other parallel in any other area of medicine, but referring to a body part in the context of it not having been subjected to an operation is just really strange. So why do we do it? It only seems to be applicable to male circumcision. I can't find any other area of medicine that does that. Okay, we're getting into the biggies now. Urinary tract infections. Alder-Hey say this: circumcision can reduce the risk of boys getting urinary tract infections, so some boys with kidney problems will be recommended to have a circumcision when they are a baby. I kind of see that as two separate statements. UTIs are an incredibly contested subject. Countries like America, it is the #1 reason used to justify routine male circumcision, reduction of UTIs. And that's a big problem because a man's UTI sits around 1.7% and a woman's sits at about 9.4, almost 5 times higher, but we don't circumcise women, we only circumcise men. There is a much better statement in the same section which says this: UTIs can normally be treated successfully with a simple course of antibiotics, and circumcision is not routinely recommended for most boys and men. That's a much better statement. I would quite like to see them delete the first half of that first statement and replace it with this. All right, things get really interesting when you read the BAPS material, and they say this: it seems disingenuous to recommend circumcision in boys with VUR when the only RCT to have considered the matter shows that it doesn't work. VUR is vesicourethral reflux, which is a condition that causes kidney problems and kidney scarring. And RCT is a randomized controlled trial. And in the world of medicine, that's the underpinning evidence that proves a treatment either works or doesn't, as the case may be. So that's the bit that we like. The RCT clearly defines what works and what doesn't. And in this case, the BAPS say that circumcision simply doesn't work for UTIs. So the available evidence raises serious doubts over the effectiveness of circumcision as a treatment. Don't get me wrong, there's not an awful lot on this online. I really struggled to find anything definitive on it. I would love to chat to Alderhay to see how they justify making this statement. They may have evidence themselves, I don't know, they're the professionals, they do this more regularly than me. So I don't want to assume that they're wrong, but they may have evidence that I'm not aware of. And 15 Square did discuss this topic with the General Medical Council back in 2012, I think it was. And they recognised that there is a lack of training in this area. And as I've said, a girl with the same condition would not be treated in this way, despite having a much higher UTI rate. Further research and training is clearly required. So I've asked Alderhay if we could have a chat about that one. Another big one, sexually transmitted infections. I'll struggle to do this justice in one slide, but we'll give it a go. It's quite interesting actually. The Alderhay website only make one statement on this. Circumcision can also reduce, but does not stop, the transmission of sexually transmitted infections. And that's it. They don't go into any more detail. They don't specify what STIs. That's it. That's all they say. My first reaction was, well, if that's it, why not just delete it? Because without further context, that statement doesn't provide any informative advice and is potentially misleading. A parent could read that and think, oh, well, you know, my child's going to grow up, have sex. If it can give them any protection, I might as well do it. And actually, that's wrong. So it is quite a misleading statement. So my first reaction was, why not remove it? However, if we want the Alderhay website to become the definitive UK national guidance, we really have to do the subject justice and go into it properly with some good detail. The NHS website says this: there's evidence from several trials carried out in Africa that circumcised men have a lower risk of acquiring HIV. I'll come back to that in a second. But it's unclear whether circumcision can help prevent STIs, other STIs. There have been several studies, but the evidence to date has been inconclusive and conflicting. So two very different statements there. Now, some websites include HIV as an STI, some don't. Some consider it as a separate issue in its own right. I do see this HIV and Africa reference being made repeatedly throughout a number of NHS websites. And the trouble with it is that Africa is a high prevalence area. Circumcision is not medically recommended to reduce or prevent STIs, including HIV, in the UK, because the UK isn't a high prevalence area. So if you're going to make that statement regarding Africa, you really have to qualify it with the UK perspective. And that's the bit that all the NHS websites seem to fail to do. So they only provide this one half of the story. And the balanced argument just doesn't seem to be evidence from the online material. There's also something called the Cochrane Review, which was an independent review which found that there was insufficient evidence to support an interventional effect of male circumcision on HIV acquisition in heterosexual men. So there is some really strong contradicting evidence here. 15 Square does have a formal position on HIV, and I've told Alderhay that we'd be happy to sit down and discuss that with them. I didn't unpack that any further within the report, simply because HIV wasn't explicitly mentioned on the Alderhay website, but I have offered that up as a potential conversation that we could have. And yeah, generally there is considerable evidence suggesting that circumcision actually does the opposite. It increases STI transmission. And I say that because countries like America, who are the only developed country in the world to actively practice routine infant male circumcision, they have one of the highest HIV infection rates per populace of any developed country in the world. And they also have the highest infection rate of the top three STIs, chlamydia, gonorrhea and syphilis. and all that despite having one of the highest concentrations of sexually active circumcised men. So it would kind of suggest completely the opposite. It doesn't actually work, but there are a lot of environmental factors that you have to take into consideration. It's not just a simple, straightforward answer. So there is quite a bit of clarification around this subject, and I don't think one sentence really does it justice. Pupilloplasty. We like pupilloplasty. Alder Hey pioneered this foreskin preserving technique, in particular triple incision pupilloplasty procedure. I'll explain why the triple incision bit is important in just a second. But this has a 80% success rate. For 1 in 5 boys it will not work, and from what I can tell from the website, you get one shot at pupilloplasty, and if that doesn't work you then move to full circumcision. But it is an option that certainly hasn't been available until recently, which is great. However, there is a slight problem with the literature. Pupilloplasty is often confused with something called a dorsal slit. There are many variations and interpretations of pupilloplasty, and I really had to dig deep and educate myself on this one. In the medical professionals webpage, each section talks about a topic, and then it gives you a list of key reference documents for the medical professionals to refer to and read. And a lot of those key references for pupilloplasty refer to it as a mini dorsal slit. Now, a dorsal slit is a very different procedure which slices the foreskin all the way down. A mini dorsal slit, the previous variations of pupilloplasty was called a pupusplasty, and it has a smaller incision, a single incision about a third of the size of a dorsal slit. And that's where the confusion with a mini dorsal slit comes from. There's all sorts of pupilloplasty. There's Z incision, Y incision. Alder Hey have a preference for the triple incision, purely because the 3 smaller incisions have the same effect as a 1 large incision, and it also produces a much better cosmetic outcome. So the Alder Hey website say on the homepage that they want to provide UK national guidance. The trouble I have with a lot of the key references on the medical professional page is that they refer to the United States, Canada, China, all these other countries that aren't relevant to the UK. Therefore, I question what the benefit of all of those references are. And certainly, the pupilloplasty section is confused by the key references because they talk about mini dorsal slits and pupusplasty. They don't actually refer to the triple incision pupilloplasty that Alder Hey are pioneering. So there is a little bit of confusion on that one. This is just a little diagram of exactly what a triple incision is. So you can see there 3 small incisions made at the opening to the foreskin. And then under anaesthetic, it's retracted, and then those 3 incisions are pulled horizontally, and that has the effect of increasing the diameter of the foreskin opening, allowing it to be retracted normally. So it's a very good procedure, and as I say, produces a much better cosmetic outcome. And it's interesting that they do consider the cosmetic aspects, because I think until recent years, that's something that's been just overlooked generally in male circumcision. But the BAUS circumcision information leaflet does list one of the key side effects as dissatisfaction with the cosmetic outcome. So it is clear that organisations like Alder Hey are taking this seriously and thinking about the cosmetic outcome and the end result. So I mentioned earlier how the BAUS have recently updated all their information leaflets, and the main difference on the circumcision information leaflet was that the BAUS have now recognised pupilloplasty as a viable alternative to circumcision, which is great. They don't yet have a separate information leaflet on pupilloplasty itself, but I'm hoping that will happen in due course. And I've recommended that Alder Hey work with BAUS to make sure that it's the triple incision method that they write a leaflet on, which would be really useful. And then we could distribute that amongst the other medical establishments and get that widely understood. Non-surgical products. So this bit isn't actually detailed to any great extent in the Alder Hey website. I was just curious to have a conversation with Alder Hey about non-surgical products that are on the market and are reported to help and possibly solve conditions like phimosis and a phimotic band. And I want to know if Alder Hey has a position on them and if they consider them as being viable options. Things like PhymoStretch, which is a phimosis stretcher ring kit. It's just literally a set of plastic rings of various sizes that you can insert into the opening of the foreskin to stretch them. It's a bit like the rings you see people have in their earlobes. Works on exactly the same principle to stretch the skin over a period of time. And it's had some good results and is reported to be very good at treating phimosis. There's also something called Novaglan, and that uses custom molded balloons for gradual skin remodeling and pupus dilation. It's a little molded balloon which you slip underneath the foreskin and then you pump it up, and that over time again stretches the foreskin. And that has some clinical trials. I think it's an Australian device, and it has some clinical trials showing some good results. And I was just interested to know what Alder-Hey's position was on devices like this. So again, it's a discussion I would like to have with them to see what their position is. And next, seeking support. So as I've said, Alder-Hey recognises the psychological and sexual impact that circumcision can have on some men. And they even provide a hyperlink to the BBC website with the article of young Alex Hardy, who Dave has mentioned already. He was a young 23-year-old man who sadly took his own life after complications with his circumcision. And his mother, Leslie Roberts, has worked with us. And as a result of that, we are now a member of the National Suicide Prevention Alliance. I thought it was a really good job of Dave getting us listed there because we have a number in our title, we appear first in the list, right top of the screen, which is great. The Alder-Hey website presents several lists in several places of mental health, therapy and counselling services. And I've provided a consolidated list here. There's 13 of them in total. They're all good, reputable charities that you'll mostly recognise, but there's two problems. Number one, 15 Square isn't on it. And number two, the only one of those 13 that mentions anything about circumcision on their website is the Men's Health Forum. None of the others even mention it. So there is a question over, well, what help are they really? The NSPCC has a policy on female genital mutilation, but it doesn't have a policy on male circumcision or male genital mutilation for that matter. 15 Square have respectfully requested Alder-Hey to add us to that list, and indeed any NHS website that provides circumcision advice. I've asked them if they would consider putting us front and centre on their list as a reputable charity that can provide support. So just to draw some conclusions, the Alder-Hey Foreskin Health website is a fantastic resource. It's long overdue and very welcome. There is some excellent information on there. I particularly like their decision-making tool. It really helps patients to think through and ask some really fundamental questions. And it emphasises the fact that circumcision is permanent. There's no going back. So you need to really consider long and hard what your decision is and why. And I think that's really important, and it's good to see. It's very, very welcome. But the medical arguments do need to consider not just the physical, but also the psychological harm caused by circumcision. And in all the BIUS leaflets, none of them mention the psychological aspect. Now, Alder-Hey have really stepped up. They have mentioned it very strongly in their website, and they've even provided some very useful links. We are actually listed on one of the links, but it's so far down the article that the chances of people seeing us, 15 Square, are limited. But yes, Alder-Hey have done it, which is great, and we support that, and they're very much aligned with 15 Square's objectives, but other NHS organisations really need to follow suit. Medical advice is sometimes confused and contradictory, and greater consistency is required. So you can see that from the examples I've shared with you today, but there's a lot more in the report that I haven't had time today to share with you. But there is a lot of confused and contradictory information out there, and it's just difficult to know, for patients and parents, what do they believe? Basic facts are often overgeneralised, which challenges the concept of full consent. Things like how much skin is removed, the function of the foreskin, the recovery time, it's all overgeneralised and belittled, and you don't realise that until it's too late. And the whole concept of full consent, what are parents consenting to? And clearly in a lot of cases what they're consenting to isn't actually what's going to be done to their child at all. Watching your child, as a parent myself, watching your child in pain is difficult. Watching a child in sexual pain is on a completely different level, because that has much greater potential to affect them long term. It's just not a good position to be in. So national UK guidance on all male foreskin surgery needs to be a lot clearer. So there's got some good information out there. We just need to improve it, and we need to think about those key references, particularly where they refer to other countries, not necessarily UK. I would like to see Alder-Hey say, well, okay, that information's fine, but what is the definitive UK national guidance? And if we can pin that down and document it, you can get rid of all those key references. Why not make all the procedures visible in the Alder-Hey website, not just pupiloplasty and circumcision? The website does tend to focus almost exclusively on those two procedures. There's lots of others. They do mention things like fenioplasty for treating a condition called fenion breve, and steroid creams, but there's a lot of other stuff that's only mentioned in the medical professionals webpage. It's not shared widely in the patient web pages, and there are other procedures that aren't mentioned at all. which the BAUS produce leaflets on. So I've recommended Alder Hey look at perhaps providing links to the BAUS information and also sharing the information from the medical healthcare professionals webpage in the other web pages as well. And there's also an issue with circumcision itself. We say circumcision. Most people have heard of that word, but what does it actually mean? They mentioned full circumcision as well. What does that mean? There's the Morgan clamp, the Gomo clamp, the sleeve method, the forceps guided method, the freehand method. There's a loose circumcision, a tight circumcision. Do you keep the frenulum, do you not? All of those are variations of circumcision. Which one is your child going to get? You don't know. It seems to me that you're at the mercy of the surgeon on the day. Whatever method they've been trained in is what your son gets. You don't get a choice in any of those things. And that's a problem because all of those different types have a different cosmetic outcome and can, in some cases, affect the recovery time. And they don't consider partial circumcisions, and I don't know why. That's something else I raised in my report. So, for example, all circumcisions in the Bible are partial circumcisions. They don't remove all the foreskin at all. Most people don't realise that because it's done on the 8th day, and an 8-day-old boy doesn't have a fully functional, fully developed foreskin. So there are some fundamental questions that I would love to get a discussion with Alder Hey to understand and to educate myself more than anything else, because there may well be perfectly logical reasons for some of these things. So I believe that 15 Square operating in this customer friend role would help to address these issues. And 15 Square, we want to collaborate with Alder Hey and help develop their online material and their website further. Look, we're not here to cause problems. We're not going to turn up on their doorstep with picket signs and banners. That's not what we do. We're all about the education, and we want to get on board and help them to improve their healthcare advice. And 15 Square want to be recognised on all NHS websites containing advice on male circumcision. That would be my key aim. I would love to get our name up there and listed on that website. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is everything. Thank you very much for your attention. Much appreciated. And if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them.